Absolutely great to be back here again. Susanna asked me, in a sense, to look back on my career reading and thinking about Jane Austen, but I hope also to offer you some fresh ideas, or perhaps from my point of view, a fresh look at some old ideas that I've had in great pleasure of looking at this material again, and also in terms of new technology, a few pictorial illustrations that show the sort of randomness of the way Jane Austen inhabits our lives once you know the novels well enough. I had my latest surprise. I have to tell you this because literally last night I was texting my daughter in London, and we are planning to go away with the family for a seaside stay in the northern summer on the North Norfolk coast. I had completely forgotten that Mr. Perry recommended Cromer. Where are we going? Cromer. So there you go. And it's Mr. Perry's recommendation. This is exactly why I chose it without remembering Mr. Perry. It's got a good beach, comparatively speaking, for the UK, and fresh air. So, having been reading Jane Austen for over 60 years and lecturing on her novels and also writing what I hope would be helpful literary, analytical, historical remarks for the last 40 odd, I am, of course, as we all are here, still thinking about her work, still struck with amazement and delight at the originality, the profundity, the wisdom, the wit, the poetry, and overall the charm in its magical sense that you can't look away. Every time I read a single sentence of hers. And that joyous experience is very similar to what I experience at a wonderful performance of a great play. My encounter with Jane Austen's imagination, what I call her three-dimensional writing, I'll get back to that term, is often, for me, like watching a very good play with fabulous actors and an occasional rather intriguing voiceover narrator just at the side of the stage. That is, she presents in her fictions bodies, like actors, speaking and moving in space and time in relation to furniture and props, just as a play in the theatre does, such that you are gripped by the characters and the narrative. You want to know what happens next, but you also don't want it to end. So when I published my book, Jane Austen in the Theatre, now 22 years ago, since I published it with Cambridge University Press, I began to analyse my sense, which had been sort of wandering around in my head, my sense of what I call Austen's theatrical imagination. And in the book, I tried to do a scholarly job and show how each of her novels could be put in conversation, as it were, with a play or with a genre of plays from that period, plays that from her own obviously extensive reading of plays and occasionally from her documented visits to the theatre. And again, we know from the remaining letters that they are probably about a tenth of those that she actually wrote. So we can perhaps even multiply her visits to the theatre by another 9 times. So what I did 22 years ago was a start, but it was by no means the final word. And today I want to talk in 2 particular areas. One is about spaces in the novels, what we think of as the novel settings, but I want to use the word spaces because I want to keep this notion of bodies in spaces, acting in spaces, at the forefront of our minds. This is a hypothetical map of Highbury that I devised in 1995 for a little book I wrote about Emma, because for about the previous 30 years I had been thinking there is something about Emma and Highbury. These beloved old editions, the Oxford Chapman edition, are my working editions, and they've got all my rude and silly markups from years and years and years of work, and I'm not ever giving them away. Chapman says in his edition of Emma, in his notes, the first, of course, English editor to write notes on Austen, and he started doing it in the 1920s, 100 years ago. Highbury has been identified with Cobham, Leatherhead, Esher and other places. It's been pointed out that there is a house called Randalls near Leatherhead, etc., etc. From our knowledge of her accuracy, we are bound to believe that if she had intended any actual place, she would have given the distances correctly. I agree. She didn't, though. That's the point. In fact, says Chapman famously, no possible place is at once 16 miles from London, 9 from Richmond and 7 from Box Hill. You can't map it. The precision of these figures was perhaps designed to preclude the possibility of a false identification. Good on you, Robert Chapman. What I argue, and have always argued, and this was the outcome of that what Austen does is use her imagination and everything that has fed into it from her local knowledge to create a parallel universe, something that we're very familiar with now from popular culture. It's all over Doctor Who. It's, all over all sorts of wonderful things that we all enjoy. But there she is, just creating that parallel universe back then. So do you think you can slip into Highbury? You can't quite, but you can be there watching it. Emma, we remember, in that famous passage, waiting outside Ford's shop for Harriet to complete her activities, her purchases, went to the door for amusement. Much could not be hoped from the traffic of even the busiest part of Highbury. Mr. Perry walking hastily by, Mr. William Cox letting himself in at the office door, Mr. Cole's carriage horses returning from exercise, or a stray letter boy on an obstinate mule were the liveliest objects she could presume to expect. And when her eyes fell only on the butcher with his tray, a tidy old woman travelling homewards from shop with her full basket, 2 curs quarrelling over a dirty bone, and a string of dawdling children round the baker's little bow window eyeing the gingerbread, she knew she had no reason to complain and was amused enough, quite enough still to stand at the door. A mind lively and at ease, says Emma, or is it our side of stage voiceover, can do with seeing nothing and can see nothing that does not answer. I think it's our ironical voiceover woman at the side. She looked down the Randalls Road, which is the middle one of the ones going to the right there in my makeup. The scene enlarged, my subject for the day. 2 persons appeared, Mrs. Weston and her son-in-law. They were walking into Highbury to Hartfield, of course. They were stopping, however, in the first place, at Mrs. Bates's. Good heavens. Whose house was a little nearer Randalls than Ford's. I'll leave it there for the time being. What's going to happen? But clues like that, it just illustrated what I'm talking about, the theatrical imagination. She's placing every body in that scene, including the dogs and the kids at the sweet shop window, very precisely. And there is Emma standing and looking at it all and feeling she is indeed the Queen of Highbury, and how satisfying that is. This passage, in fact, as I've more and more come to feel, and the passages following, chapters 27 to 28, if you're doing the count through, they are literally the fulcrum of the novel. Look at that. It's halfway through. It's what you get in Shakespeare when you get to the beginning of Act 3. It's where everything's been set up, everybody's arrived, things are going to start going into a very, very complicated knot and then a denouement. Brilliant craftswoman, among so many other things. At this point, we can say Emma's little world that she is surveying from the door of Ford's is going to start to change irrevocably. For the first 10 years after my retirement from the University of Sydney, I lived, get this, in the neighbourhood of Brunswick Square. It was about 400 yards from my square, which was Argyle Square, and I had a little garret there, a fanny-like garret. By the way, I should tell you, don't read the top of the map there as north. That's east is at the top of the map. That's old mapping practice. You can see the church, west door there. So that's the way it's oriented. I had to move from the neighbourhood of Brunswick Square, airy though it was. And so my daughter found us a beautiful house, first floor of which, the drawing room floor, as it were, to echo Mrs. Bates, in Walthamstow Village, which is now, of course, totally suburbanised. It's railwayised, it's got Victorian rows and rows, acres and acres and acres of Victorian terraces, but we are still within 100 yards walk of old Walthamstow Village. And when I found this map, and when I began myself as a body to walk around Walthamstow Village, I realised that again I was walking in one of those classic villages, a sort of Highbury. And the map you can spend many happy hours, as I have done this week, comparing the details on this map with the details on my map of Highbury, and I'm really pleased with myself with how much of it corresponds, including things like the poor people's cottages. I'm sorry you can't see it there, but up the top there's a small amount of ground labelled Poor of Walthamstow. And I mean, it's just on the other side of the road from where I put them in Highbury. So I'm feeling pretty pleased about that. Walthamstow has been a prosperous village on the edge of Epping Forest from at least the 12th century. The Reverend Mr. Wilson, who was the vicar of Walthamstow during Jane Austen's lifetime, has a very good-sized glebe, which again one can see on the map. There's the church, there's his glebe. You compare churchyard to glebe, it's a massive glebe. Mr. Elton has not got anything like that. I thought at first that was the fault of my map making, but I was more right than I thought, because I went back to the novel, and when Mr. Elton was introduced early in the novel, I read, again through the eyes of those who know in Highbury, for though the vicarage of Highbury was not large, he was known to have some independent property, so he doesn't need a big glebe like as Mr. Austen had and as the Reverend Wilson had to grow his fruit and veggies and to run his sheep and cattle, which is what Mr. Austen had at Steventon. So here is Walthamstow St Mary's Church, of which is literally 5 minutes walk from my new place, my now 2-year-old place. I love the fact that this pathway, which I walk along a lot, doesn't have cows in it anymore, only because the graveyard has got too full in the intervening 200 plus years. And the graveyard now surrounds 3 parts of the church, but the church still basically looks like that. Of course, because it was a prosperous village, it kept being added onto. But you can put your hands on the original early 12th century fabric just as you go in the west door, and you can read the list of all the vicars since the first vicar in the early 12th century. And the current vicar is the first one who is a woman. So there you are. Opposite the church in Walthamstow, there are what are called these ancient dwellings. They're the only 2 remaining ancient dwellings in the now very large suburb of Walthamstow. As I said, it's mostly now Victorian terrace building, but they are genuinely ancient. One of them, as you can see, is a 16th century building. It's been restored, but not wrongly. And next to it's the one I really like, which is obviously sometime in the 1700s. It's an 18th century weatherboard. It's got 1 story above the shop window. That's why I've called it, it's my idea of the Bates's house on the high street. I looked at it and I thought, that's what the Bates, it might have been brick in Surrey, but the shape, I think, is about it, is about right. We do know, again, Austen tells us, that in chapter 1 of volume 2, the Bates's house, which was, we know from various other evidence, overlooked the high street, belonged to people in business. I think that's a euphemism for having a shop on the ground floor. It's in the high street, why would you not? Mrs. and Miss Bates occupied the drawing room floor, that is the one with the actual ceiling as opposed to the one with the pointy garret, which is where that hard-working single servant has her bed and her little dressing table. It was a very moderate size apartment, we are told, and the smallness of the Bates' apartment is something that is emphasised throughout the novel, and it's something I will return to. Let me, however, go to something unique to Walthamstow, Mrs. Squire's almshouses, which are just at the end of the west door of the church in a pathway about 50 yards away. They're a very fine set of 6, I think, almshouses, single story, brick built, as you see, because they're built during Austen's lifetime, in her 20th year, 1795. I'll read you the wonderful, this brings me great joy, the plaque on the original one. These houses are erected and endowed forever, full stop, by Mrs. Mary Squires, widow, for the use of 6 decayed tradesmen's wives. Sorry, widows, I misread, but you get the point here. It's not 6 decayed tradesmen, it's their widows. It's a feminist gesture by Mrs. Mary Squires, and I love the way she finishes, of widows of this parish and no other. Anno Domini 1795. That fills me with joy every time I see it. And look at it, look at the date, 1795. It's, you know, it's just right. It's that thinking is in the air, and Jane Austen in her 20th year is picking up on it. Now, of course, the visitors to Highbury include Jane Fairfax and, quickly on her heels, Frank Churchill. At this point, we are asked to consider, by the shape of the novel, what happens if you don't always stay in Highbury, where you are comfortable, where everything is satisfactory. Far from Surrey and what are called the home counties, what, for example, can happen at a seaside resort? Seaside resorts, which are a newish thing, I've got a little extract to read you here, have a largely random population visiting a well-off population, supported, of course, by the locals who work for them, but the majority of the population, of course, as we also see in Sanditon, they were visiting only for the pursuit of pleasure. And how you define pleasure is going to include eating, drinking, and a good deal of illicit, perhaps, sex. I quote now from the Weymouth Museum website. In the Georgian period, when medical science of the day declared sea bathing to be good for the health, Weymouth began its rise as a seaside resort. George III's decision to come to Weymouth in 1789 for his health led the town to become the most celebrated and visited watering place in the land. Now, this is one of my delighted, unexpected discoveries, this little illustration. I've subsequently found it in one of my many coloured illustrations of Jane Austen's life. It is a painting, a rough oil sketch by John Constable, dated 1816, of what is actually called Bowley's Cove in Weymouth Bay. And it is held in a back room in the Victoria and Albert, where I was wandering one day and suddenly I thought, good Lord, what is that? And I immediately, took down the details, took a photograph, and finally bought a print of it and have framed it, sitting in my study in Walthamstow. The Victoria and Albert curator's note says, Constable painted this oil sketch of Bowleys Cove in Weymouth Bay during his honeymoon in 1816. So, this is licit sex that he's going to Weymouth for, rather nice to think. It served as a study for a painting that was exhibited 3 years later, which is not something I followed up, but I may one day. Then the commentator who clearly doesn't know her Jane Austen, but the commentator goes on to say, the figures on the beach may represent his hosts, the Reverend and Mrs. Fisher, or the artist and his bride. If you look closely at that, that's a clergyman in his daily black with Mrs. Fisher. Constable is painting. It's clearly not Constable representing himself and his new young bride. It's not romantic enough in that sense. What it is very romantic in the sense of the skyscraper, the landscape. Susanna reminded us that Turner was born in the year of Austen's birth, and of course Constable was also of that generation, and both of them reinvented the sense of how we see the British, particularly the English, landscape. This is undoubtedly a romantic scene, not, as I say, for its celebration of sexuality, but for its entry into that discourse, that new discourse of the landscape of Britain that all the poets, old mate Wordsworth, for example, were writing about in this period. This is not the calm and civilised resort that is usually pictured in books in reference to Weymouth. This is also, of course, the scene of Mr. Dixon's heroic saving of Jane Fairfax from being knocked overboard during a squally pleasure party on a yacht. And until I saw that painting, I thought it must have been a fairly feeble event, that, I didn't believe what Jane Austen was saying, but in fact she was telling the truth. That's what Constable saw. And the way the boom of the yacht's sail moved could easily have knocked Jane overboard, and of course she couldn't swim. That would be the end of that story. But of course Emma, as we know, makes up another story based on that romantic event. Jane Fairfax's experience of a world, a space that your body lives in, both emotional and physical, as we saw in this narrated event about Mr. Dixon's rescue of her, a world that reflects the turn to romanticism with a capital R, the sort of stuff that we English academics like to put with a capital R to distinguish it from common or garden feelings about romance. The turn to romanticism in a recognition of the forces of nature, which are outside us, but also inside us, in our hearts, our bodies, our minds. They're everywhere, this turbulent world of emotions which can be echoed in the landscape and the skyscape and the waterfalls and so on, rather than the beautiful managed landscape of Mr. Repton and his friends. And of course, we like to think that Jane Fairfax's sense of having a romantic life in that more common sense, a turbulent, passionate, secret romantic life, would be reflected in her very superior piano playing. Emma is the first to acknowledge that Jane is a much better pianist than Emma is, but all we hear about Jane playing in the novel is in fact the waltzes that we danced to last night and the songs that she sings, including some in Italian. Harriet didn't like the ones in Italian, but of course Frank Churchill, she sings Robin Adair, but he likes it. It's a folk song. So it's the sort of stuff that we know from the wonderful work done by Gillian Dooley that Jane Austen was also playing and familiar with. What we want to map onto it, and there is a reason for this, is Beethoven, frankly. That's what we want to map onto it. the Appassionata Sonata, the Hammerklavier, the Moonlight, you know? And Beethoven wouldn't have been composing them on a Broadwood square piano, which is exactly the period of the novel, and is, I think, a rather showy example of the decorative work that Frank would have laid out his money, or his stepmother's, mother-in-law's, not whatever, money on. The Broadwood piano of the early 19th century was technically supreme in the Western world. It was the best piano. I've gone down so many rabbit holes about pianos in the last month or so. I had to review something else about Austen and music, which is where I got started on this. This is a bit like an IKEA piano for all its good looks. You can, it's in bits, so you could get it up. Those, we are reminded, narrow steps up to the first floor drawing room of the Bateses' apartment, and the legs would be put on later, and then Frank, of course, is adjusting a bit of paper under the legs to make it sit straight. This was, as it's labelled, I mean, its technical name is a Broadwood square piano, and there's a lovely website by piano historian Michael Cole, and I quote him: "The prestige of the Broadwood Company was very high on the concert scene, their grand pianos being very much in demand, yet until 1850, square pianos for the home were always Broadwood's best-selling product." Now, Broadwood sent, and if I had more time, I could give you a picture of this, but it's very common, sent one of its absolutely modern, state-of-the-art grand pianos with a six-octave range, unheard of before that, to Beethoven as a gift. As a gift in 1817. He was pretty deaf by then, but he loved it, and he knew, and from then on that was his favourite piano for playing and composing on, because it was responsive. It gave him the feeling that would create the Hammerklavier and the Appassionata sonatas. Mr. Broadwood's grand piano. Why I put the earlier Clementi Collard up there, because I just thought it was amusing, and I'm absolutely convinced that that was sitting in Lady Catherine de Bourgh's sitting room at Rosings, a bit old-fashioned, a bit last century, you know, adequate, but as Elizabeth says in that amazing conversation with Darcy, I'm not a great performer, I don't practice enough. And there's all that hilarious stuff from Lady Catherine about how Anne would have been a superb performer if she were well enough to learn. It's a wonderful scene of double meaning, triple meaning banter between Darcy and Elizabeth, where they are just, it's gorgeous stuff, isn't it? It's a great scene. But I think Elizabeth was sitting at this rather old-fashioned looking piano of Lady Catherine's, which is in fact never touched, because Anne doesn't play, Lady Catherine doesn't, of course. It was probably appallingly out of tune, truth be told, but there you go. So that's all I have to say about pianos. We'll now move on to the second half. We're going all right. As I was just saying, chapter 28, that is to say the chapter immediately after the one I read you about the scene enlarging, they enter the Bateses' apartment, that is to say Emma and Harriet. They go in, and what do they say? This is a fabulous chapter beginning. Some of us can recite it, I'm quite sure. The appearance of the little sitting room as they entered was tranquility itself. Mrs. Bates, deprived of her usual employment, slumbering on one side of the fire, Frank Churchill, at a table near her, most deedily occupied about her spectacles, and Jane Fairfax standing with her back to them, there's a stage direction for you, intent on her pianoforte. Now you can't play one of these standing up. There is a piano stool, and 2 pages later we are told that she's feeling composed enough to sit at the piano again. So, as I think John Mullen, among other people, but certainly including myself, have inferred, there's been a bit of let's say, hanky-panky, a bit of a long longed for embrace going on between Frank and Jane as Mrs. Bates slumbers. Busy as he was, the young man was yet able to show a most happy countenance on seeing Emma again. "This is a pleasure," said he in rather a low voice. Could have been more pleasure, coming at least 10 minutes earlier than I had calculated. He says, then says Mrs. Weston, haven't you finished fixing those spectacles yet?" "I've not been working uninterruptedly," he replied. "I have been assisting Miss Fairfax in trying to make her instrument stand steadily." I mean, if you were into double entendres, you would be having a good time here. It was not quite firm, an unevenness in the floor, I believe. You see, we've been wedging one leg with paper and so on. As I say, a little bit later, she feels comfortable enough to sit again at the piano and play by request. Frank says, "What felicity it is to hear a tune again which has made one happy. If I mistake not, that was danced at Weymouth." So you see, we're being told what sort of music Jane is actually playing. She looked up at him for a moment, coloured deeply, and played something else. This is where you need an actress who can blush on command, on demand. Emma sees all this. She's good at looking at things, she's just not quite all that good at interpreting them. When, on glancing her eye towards Jane Fairfax, she caught the remains of a smile, she saw that with all the deep blush of consciousness, there had been a smile of secret delight. It's a glorious phrase, and we're the lucky ones who get it. She doesn't. I mean, she sees that there's something going on, but she gets it wrong, Emma. We are the readers who are allowed this fabulous empathetic frisson, particularly, of course, if we're rereading it for the umpteenth time. And we think, oh, how lovely for them. Yeah, it is pretty good, just being in love, you know? So to move away from Emma now, I want to talk a bit about Mansfield Park, because as you know, I love Mansfield Park. I'm a great defender of it. This novel is obsessed with the spaces in which what we might call in modern critical parlance, embodied Fanny experiences her life. Mansfield Park's grandeur, Fanny's small and originally very cold east room, the parsonage, which we will return to, Southerton's magnificent chapel. Unusual in Austen to hear of that architectural detail. The wilderness at Southerton, the small, crowded and very grubby Portsmouth house to which she returns. And then the novel's final paragraph, just to remind us, says that the author of what we are talking about, or what I've been talking about, what you may have been noticing emanating from my theatrical imagination on the subject of spaces. This is the whole of the last paragraph of Mansfield Park. They've got married. On that event, they removed to Mansfield, it's death of Dr. Grant. On that event, they removed to Mansfield, and the parsonage there, which under each of its two former owners, Fanny had never been able to approach, but with some painful sensation of restraint or alarm, soon grew as dear to her heart and as thoroughly perfect in her eyes as everything else within the view and patronage of Mansfield Park had long been. We end in a space re-seen, reclaimed, a space that is proper for Fanny at last. She's been in such terrible and disturbing spaces for so long, one of which we will now go to. Fanny's east room. Pretty cold facing the east in Britain most of the time. You want a south facing room if you want some natural warmth. The objects that Fanny has been able to collect in her east room over the years of her living in it or inhabiting it as her sitting room, are often discussed, the books and the transparencies and what have you. There's lots of commentaries on that you can read. Worthy educational books, I mean, good stuff that Austen obviously approved of, moral writers and so on, simple pictures. But during the episode of the theatricals, one book is brought into Fanny's private space that she has curated against her will. The book of Mrs. Inchbald's Lover's Vows for the so-called rehearsal, aka private performance of desire between Edmund and Mary, the rehearsal of the scene between Anhalt and Amelia, where basically Amelia proposes marriage to the Reverend Anhalt. Fanny is the unwilling but fascinated audience of this private theatrical, as Edmund and Mary, aka Anhalt and Amelia, discuss the pros and cons of marriage and flirt like mad, basically. To a conservative, timid mind like Fanny's, this book is not safe, unlike her other named books. And I keep using the word book, I'm putting it in inverted commas again for a reason. I wish I could bring you a copy of the book of Lover's Vows, but they were flimsy. They'd be, this is a facsimile of Songs of Innocence and Experience. It's about the right size, but it wouldn't have been hardbound. So that's about, but it's paper bound. What is this book, of which there were enough copies for a cast of 9 or 10 amateur actors all to have a copy to learn their lines from in a country house? It was, in fact, more of a small-sized pamphlet, as I've just shown you. They cost 6pence each, which is an easy outlay for a rich household. They are designed to be bound up eventually in your own collection of contemporary plays, or the same plates are used by the very entrepreneurial Mr. John Bell, not our John Bell, but it always amuses me that he's the publisher of Lover's Vows, among other things, into a volume in the very long series called Bell's British Theatre. And that's a good fat, they're smaller, they're like a fat version of this. And you can find copies of them. When I first started looking at this stuff 30 odd years ago, when we made a film, a little, terrible little film, but some wonderful performances in it, of our production of Lover's Vows, the original early 19th century Bell's British Theatre copies were available on OpenStack in Fisher Library. I eventually went to Redbrooks and said, do you realise what you've got there? Please take them away and put them somewhere safe. And they are small. But this was a very, this shows the dominance of the interest in theatre among the British reading public, the gentry class of the last 30 odd years of the 18th century and well into the next 20 to 30 of the 19th. That the books of current contemporary successful plays at Drury Lane, Covent Garden could be printed very, very quickly, within a week, these pamphlets. Within a week of the first production of Lover's Vows, less than a week, it was available in pamphlet form, in so-called book form. And eventually, as I say, it would be those plates would be reprinted and bound into a volume, and if you bought the volume, you got the illustrations. This is the illustration, of course, that is very familiar to us all of the last scene of Lover's Vows that was only available not in the book that they're all rehearsing with, that was only a pamphlet, no pictures, though you could have bought, I've been looking at the advertisements for this stuff, you could have bought, if you paid a bit more, an early version of what the illustration was going to be for each play, and that was this. But I'd need to do a lot more research to find on that. But I was asked was during COVID. I was asked by a young Canadian scholar in the field of romantic women's writing to contribute to an encyclopedia of romantic women writers and to write an encyclopedia entry about Elizabeth Inchbald, particularly about this adaptation for the English stage of Kotzebue's Das Kind der Liebe, the love child, which of course had this massive afterlife, very largely due to Mansfield Park and the readers of Mansfield Park keeping the play in people's minds. And my argument in this essay, which was eventually published online, I'll put the reference in the printed version of this talk, was that Inchbald had demonstrably, in 1798, rewritten the German original to improve and complexify the role of the young romantic comedy heroine, Amelia, who is obviously an Elizabeth Bennet-like wit and banterer, but also, as we see in Mansfield Park, an avatar of the very disruptive, equally bantering Mary Crawford. In Inchbald's English version of the play, the liberal political views, and I use liberal in that 18th century Burkean, is it Burke or the other bloke, sense, of Kotzebue were refocused to reflect the much more radical views of Mary Wollstonecraft on the rights of women, to education and to choice in their romantic and life partners. It's all there in Inchbald's scene in which Amelia virtually proposes to that uptight pillar of the clergy, Anhalt. And it's expanded in Austen's scene. As we said, we have that famous, again, stage direction. She, Fanny, could not always pay attention to the book. She's supposed to be giving them cues. In watching them, she forgot herself and, agitated by the increasing spirit of Edmund's manner, had once closed the page and turned away exactly as he wanted help. Perfect stage direction. So in my deep dive into the actual book that these young amateur actors were using, I went beyond Inchbald's English version and I called up the digital version of Kotzebue's original text, which was printed, of course, in Gothic black letter type. Now, what I didn't know, I wonder how many, maybe if you're a German scholar you know this, I did not know until I did this work that all publishing in German was done in black letter until the late 1930s, when Hitler's propaganda machine decided that publishers would be told to publish stuff in Roman type from now on because they were going to take over France and Germany and Italy, who all use Roman type. And they had to be able to read the propaganda. This is true. So my attempts to find a copy of the Kotzebue in Roman type were frustrated. I had to teach myself to read black letter German. It's hard, it's cloggy, unless of course you learnt German before the Second World War. My mother did, I mean, I speak of that with interest. It's not a typeface for comedy. It's not a typeface for fast, witty banter. Scholars, bluestockings, Joanna Plumptree, for example, contemporaries of Inchbald, complained that Kotzebue's philosophical depth had been lost in the version that they saw on the stage in Mrs. Inchbald's version. All the sort of finger-wagging moralising that Kotzebue does, I read every word of it. It's been cut. It's not there in the Inchbald, the parallel text. All that moralising is cut, all that being kind to the lower classes stuff. Instead, there is substituted the tropes of English comedy, which had been such a success in the 18th century. You can see, I mean, these are the stage directions. I mustn't waste time. Yeah. The stage directions are very precise in Kotzebue. They in fact dictate that scene as played by Inchbald's actors, where Anhalt has to look to heaven because Kotzebue says so, where Amelia is allowed to lean upon him. That's in Kotzebue's stage directions. But Kotzebue says she wipes a tear from her eye. That direction is not in the much more comic version that we get from Inchbald. Such is the fascinating detail. But that was my adventure in black letter Gothic. Finally then, I want to say a few words about persuasion. The frisson of attraction between bodies in specific spatial situations, which is so summed up in that tiny room of Fanny's, suddenly full of, yes, wrongly directed sexual desire. It's even more powerfully represented, isn't it? Don't we agree? In the love story of Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth. Anne is often, like Fanny, audience at the banal chatter of her family. She'd rarely herself listen to if she offers an observation, like poor old Fanny asking about the slave trade. Occasionally, Anne is the musician accompanying their socialising, playing any available piano for a spontaneous dance, just as Jane Fairfax will have done in Highbury at the Coleses' dinner. But Anne does always speak up when there is a need. She gains ever more eloquence, especially in Volume 2 in Bath, particularly, for example, as she steps forward, again a stage direction, to speak to Captain Wentworth at the Assembly Rooms concert, and finally making her life-changing speech about women's feelings on an ad hoc stage of a window recess in the White Hart Hotel. Audience not attending, that's standard for the 18th century, they were thinking about their other things. But we, once again, we're the audience. And so is Captain Wentworth. So we're in good position there. And that, of course, is in the revised chapter. I love the fact that we can see her thinking, that theatrical imagination at work. I can do a better reconciliation. I can involve my thinking about the theatricality of life by writing this scene rather than the one that we can all read that was cancelled, the private scene. Unlike the earlier heroines, Anne is notably conscious of her body throughout the short 2-volume novel and its sensations. We all know about heroines who get tired when they go for walks, but only one heroine, Anne Elliot, has an obstreperous child removed from her back. She found herself in the state of being released from Charles, one of them. Someone was taking him from her, though he had bent down her head so much that his little sturdy hands were unfastened from around her neck, and he was resolutely borne away before she knew that Captain Wentworth had done it. Her sensations on the discovery made her perfectly speechless. She could not even thank him. She could only hang over little Charles with most disordered feelings. Wentworth finds a way through the agency of this unknowing, obstreperous, climbing on your back child to be in physical contact with Anne again. And it's not just an accident, because it happens again within a couple of chapters. Some weeks after she's got used to his being again in the same rooms, we have that glorious detailed event of the ride home in the carriage. I'll shorten it. You can all go home and reread it again with delight. He sees that she's tired. The Admiral and Mrs. Croft offer a lift home, saving a mile's walk to any of the ladies. It's Captain Wentworth who puts her there. She was in the carriage and felt that he had placed her there, that his will and his hands had done it. Now, when I think about English poetry, I like to look at the way the English language is blessed with monosyllables and how powerful they are. And look at that last sentence I just read you, that his will and his hands had done it. It's got a finality, an astonishing physicality. It's not foldy-rolled off either with Germanic multisyllabic words or with Latinate Johnsonian abstract nouns. She felt that he had placed her there, that his will and his hands had done it. Yeah, I defy you to find a more powerful monosyllabic sentence in Jane Austen. There's a job for you. It's an extraordinary sentence. As Captain Wentworth and Anne walk, they choose to walk away from the crowds. We might just have to read this because it makes a nice bookend to the Emma passage that we started with. And again, map of Bath. At least we've still got a map of Bath, and it is absolutely precise. Bath's a real place, still there, and you can still walk that walk. And this is the first photograph of the gravel walk that I ever took on an old-fashioned pre-iPhone camera. I was so thrilled to find it was real, that she hadn't made it up. It was there. It's in winter, which is exactly when it should be, February, just before spring. Spring comes in the last paragraph of Persuasion, as you remember. In half a minute, Charles was at the bottom of Union Street again, and the other two, i.e. Anne and Wentworth, proceeding together. And soon words enough had passed between them to decide their direction towards the comparatively quiet and retired gravel work. That adverb, comparatively, is doing a lot of work there. If this is Bath. Bath has been noisy. This is a comparatively quiet and retired gravel walk, where the power of conversation would make the present hour a blessing indeed, and prepared for it all the immortality which the happiest recollections of their own future lives could bestow. You can feel that sort of Latin soothing balm coming over their souls. They don't have to be so intense anymore. But the paragraph ends with this lovely, again, evocation of the life, the real life, the ordinary everyday life that's going on around them, just as we saw in the Emma passage. And there, as they slowly paced the gradual ascent, heedless of every group around them, seeing neither sauntering politicians, bustling housekeepers, flirting girls, nor nursery maids and children, they could indulge in those retrospections and acknowledgements, and especially in those explanations of what had directly preceded the present moment, which was so poignant and so ceaseless in interest. It's just another list of ordinary folk going about their life in a slightly different town. It's the ordinary real world mark, but there's something special at the centre of it, and it's the sharing, finally, the sharing of love and knowledge between these two people. It's the most extraordinary image of the bringing together of lovers, not in some romantic, cliched, breathless, dare I say it, Wuthering Heights style of, you know what I mean. And so different from those crowded rooms full of socialising bodies that were once Anne's lot, where the safest she could be was at the keyboard of a piano or looking out of a window. And you see what that brought, because Persuasion, all these novels, of course, are in fact fictions, crafted fictions, where always someone significant comes into view, enters upon the stage of the drama that is Austen's novel. Conclusion. There are so many details like this in every one of the novels, all worth investigating, all capable of taking us into the world of Austen's characters, and thereby conducting us into an even greater empathy with them, to a sense that they, like ourselves, extend infinitely into the world around us. All of us, butterflies, that butterfly wing in South America that Stoppard talks about in Arcadia, are creating our tiny waves of air and electricity and changing the world that we live in. And this, of course, my tribute now to the Jane Austen Society of Australia and others. This is what the Jane Austen Societies of our world do. That's what you do. You read over and over again to find the details, to explore the particular things that interest you, the clothes, the transport, the whatever, infinite, because it's all imagined in the round, real. The Austen Societies encourage us to look at every detail and thereby understand more of their characters' being, their environment, their choices and chances, their bodies in those detailed and precise spaces, their activities, their interactions. And as we do that, we learn more on every rereading of Austen's uniquely precise and profound writing, using, as she herself said, the best chosen language. Thank you. I've got 2 slides that are at a tiny postscript. I'm going to spend 30 seconds talking about them. This is the Sevenoaks Parish Marriage Register of 1802. Down the bottom here is a cousin of Jane Austen's called Elizabeth Austen. Deirdre Le Fay thinks that they only met when Elizabeth was about 7 and Jane was 5 years older, 13, or would have been 13 in that year. But who knows, again, she might have, there's the other letters, they might have gone again. It's in Kent. They are the daughters of Francis Motley Jr. They are, and it's very hard to get my head around this, they are great, they're cousins or second cousins, Elizabeth and Jane. They are of the same generation at any rate. The marriage is to Mr. William Skyring. If you come from Brisbane, there's a Skyring Terrace in central Brisbane. The Skyring family emigrated en masse to Brisbane and built it the way it is today. One of them was my great-great-uncle, and he it was who married this. So I am connected by marriage, remotely. There were no children from that marriage. Elizabeth died in 1806, and he married again. But when my second or third cousin brought this to me saying, "Did you know Jane Austen was in our family tree?" I said, never, no. But there you go. There you go. People can look at it.
That was fabulous, Penny. Thank you so much. Of course, I especially love the Emma section of your talk. That close analysis, looking at every word, is just so valuable and just reminds us why we go back and reread these novels again and again. Does anyone have questions? We've got a few minutes.
Thank you so much, that was wonderful. A question that we were discussing briefly here when you were referring to the squires
Almshouses, yeah.
Was whether decayed wives still reside in those arms.
But yes, because she said it's there in the riddle forever. What I did read about, again, I've looked them up, on the St Mary's website, and it's all quite respectable. They have sort of expanded it to single women of any, they don't have to be widows now, but if they are single women who need assistance, they're there for them.
I enjoyed your talk very much. I was a little lost in it because I'm about 60 years behind you in reading Jane Austen. I'm trying to catch up fast. But I've just read Sense and Sensibility, and you pointed out that Emma had a sort of hinge point at the middle. And in Sense and Sensibility, there's a toothpick case which seems to me a hinge point metaphorically.
Nice point. It could well be. Look, it's one of my favourite fun things to do is literally to find the middle page of what I think is a well-constructed story and see what's going on there. Because beautifully, we do have the example of Shakespeare, who just wrote the most brilliant beginning of Act 3 in practically every play he ever wrote.
Actually, we've got one of the sensibilities, an early one. We've got a paper on that.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yes.
Something, Jane Austen's something turds.
Oh, I didn't. I remember. I was here for that. Yes. Yeah. I can't remember who it was. But terrific. Thank you. Look, I deeply regret not talking about Sense and Sensibility, which I also love. But we do all have afternoon tea who have.
Penny, I'm intrigued by the sauntering politicians.
Yes. It means people.
Long way from London.
They're not politicians. If you can check that in the dictionary. It's a generic term meaning quite often chap talking to each other about important things in the way that chaps do. Sauntering. No woman in that period would saunter. No lady.
No.
So by inference, yeah.
Penny, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
We have spoken and we have
shared
offices.
campus.
We have, that's right. On behalf of all of us in Jazza, thank you so much for indulging us and taking us through your own journey of your own theatrical imagination, your own parallel universe, and therefore expanding our own view of everything and anything about Jane Austen, using maps to guide us through clues, double meanings and triple meanings, evoking our own smiles of secret delight. It was a wonderful opening talk for this very special year, and I'm going to go back and read all of them all over again.